most recent Nscaled webinar. I'm Andrew Lockhart. I'm the Vice President of Marketing for Nscaled. Wanted to take about the next 30 minutes of your time to discuss a few of the topics that we think are important for companies that are looking at recovery as a service as part of their business continuity plan. There's been a lot written recently as recovery as a service has become a more popular option. Unfortunately, a lot of what's being written is pretty basic, simple stuff. And we wanted to go a little bit deeper into some of the technologies, some of the more nuanced decisions that businesses have to make in order to determine if recovery as a service is right for them, and then to make sure they choose the right provider of recovery as a service. So we wanted to hit on 5 topics today that we think are important considerations. We're going to talk about backup because unfortunately there's a lot of businesses who seem to regard backup as their disaster recovery plan, and we'd like to try to convince you that that's not a good idea. A lot has been written on the internet about how you should prioritize what gets protected for disaster recovery, and we've seen some pretty misguided things out there, and we'd like to give you our opinion about how you should go about prioritizing the servers and the data and the workloads that you're going to protect. We want to talk about how you protect heterogeneous environments. The topic can be very simple if you happen to be one of those rare shops that everything runs on an x86 box, everything runs on the same OS, everything runs in the same hypervisor. But if you're one of the majority of companies where that's just not the case, you need to be careful in choosing your recovery as a service solution. Different methods for protecting data and workloads apply to different environments and different applications. We want to discuss how you should assess your environment and figure out what are the best data protection tools. And then for those of you who have attended any of our previous sessions, you won't be surprised to hear us talking about testing. This is the elephant in the room very often with companies that have cobbled together some sort of disaster recovery plan. They don't test it, and as we like to say, if you haven't tested it, it's not disaster recovery. So backup. Backup is very appealing to a lot of the smaller and mid-sized companies that we talk to. It's more affordable. It tends to be simpler to use. In the last few years, cloud-based storage and cloud-based backup services have popped up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, and they can be very appealing based on their simplicity and their price. Unfortunately, we see a lot of companies that try to convince themselves that by using some sort of backup, whether it's old school tape-based or one of the new online services, that they have a disaster recovery plan, that they have a business continuity plan in place. They don't. You just can't treat backup as your DR plan. Yes, you've got another copy of your data. Perhaps it's a very recent copy, perhaps not, depending on how frequently you're doing your backups. But if you should have a catastrophic failure of your data center and the primary servers you're using, it could take you the better part of a day, and very often multiple days, to set up a new data center site, buy the hardware, install the operating system and the applications, and then finally recover the data from your backup solution. And we still haven't met a business that can afford to be out of business for that many days, just absolutely offline, off the internet, and not providing IT services to their employees. It's just not feasible. Data recovery is great, but it's really just a piece of the puzzle. With disaster recovery solutions, you're going to have the ability, sure, to recover data if you delete a file, if you have a virus corrupt a database, whatever it might be. But you also have the ability to recover a server if you have a hardware failure or a software glitch, or if you've installed a new update that wreaks havoc and you need to roll back. You need to recover that entire server, including the data and the workloads it was running at the time of the last backup. And then, of course, the term disaster recovery was originally coined to talk about when you lose your whole data center: earthquake, flood, fire, blackout. And again, you need to be able to get up and running all of your critical business systems somewhere other than that primary data center, somewhere that hasn't been affected by the disaster. That's what disaster recovery is, and that's all the things that you're not going to get from a backup solution. Conversely, if you take the time to implement a disaster recovery solution, you will have backup as a feature, essentially. And this is the way we're urging businesses to look at it. Backup is a feature of having a real business continuity and disaster recovery plan in place. If you choose the right solution, the ability to recover a file that you've accidentally deleted just becomes a feature of your overall protection scheme. People understand instinctively that they need to prioritize what are the most important business systems, which ones absolutely need to be protected with a disaster recovery plan. And they do prioritize because disaster recovery in the past has been expensive. You had to go rent some co-location space, preferably not in the same town as your primary data center, rack space, power. You had to buy equipment and install it, install all the operating systems and applications and keep them patched, keep them on a par with your production systems. It was labor intensive, and it was capital expense intensive, and so prioritization became important. Unfortunately, we're seeing people on the internet talking about prioritizing what to protect on a file-by-file basis. This might work for the sole proprietor with very few business systems who actually knows file-by-file what he or she wants to protect. But that way lies madness if you're a mid-sized or larger company. You need to be thinking about prioritization. What are your Tier 1 and Tier 2 and Tier 3 applications on an application-by-application basis? What are these business systems that you rely on? Is it your content management system? Is it your Oracle database? Is it email? What vertical specific applications are you running that need to be prioritized? And it's not simply a binary decision, should I protect this server, this application, or shouldn't I? You need to think about what is the recovery point objective, the RPO, i.e., how old can the data be that I'm recovering from? And you need to choose the recovery time objective, the RTO. How long will it take me to get the duplicate server up and running in the event of a disaster? And again, the rule of thumb in the past has been that the shorter the RPO and RTO that you wanted, the more you had to pay. And it was a big breakthrough a few years ago when companies would offer 4 hours RPO and 4 hours RTO, because in the past 24 or even 48 hours were all that were available. So prioritization is still important, but again, please don't look at it on a file-by-file basis. Think about, of all those servers and systems you're running, which ones would you have to keep your business running, whether it's the customer-facing website, perhaps, if you're an e-commerce site. It might be the document management system if you're a law firm or accounting firm and you have a lot of documents that you deal with between yourself and your client. What are those key systems that have to run if your business is going to stay in business? Now, the funny thing about all this is that the need to prioritize is diminishing. It hasn't gone away. You still need to do it. You still have to go through that exercise as a business, as an IT organization. But I will point out that one of the things that's making prioritization go away is the fact that the overall cost of having disaster recovery is dropping dramatically. It's gone down by at least a factor of 10 in the last 3 years because technologies like virtualization and doing DR in the cloud, recovery as a service, what we're talking about today, where the provider can use public cloud technology, shared physical resources, but private virtual networks within those resources for data privacy. The provider can over-provision systems there are tremendous economies of scale possible there that are then passed on to the customer. My point is that 3 or 4 years ago, when disaster recovery could be quite expensive, you had to prioritize, and unfortunately, companies sometimes cut, not just the fat, but the muscle right to the bone in terms of the systems they protected. And getting back to my earlier point, they cut all the way and said, well, we can't even afford to do DR, we're just going to do backup and hope for the best. These days, the price points on disaster recovery have come down so far that as you go through the prioritization process, what we hope businesses are going to realize is they can afford to protect all of the Tier 1 applications, probably all or most of their Tier 2 applications, and it's at a price that doesn't break the bank. So do the prioritization, do it on a system-by-system basis, but look for the opportunity to protect much more of your data center environment. Now, disaster recovery can be much more straightforward if you've got a completely homogeneous environment. If everything you run, I mean, this is sort of a holy grail, and we hear people talk about it, particularly certain vendors. Everything is Windows OS running virtually in a VMware hypervisor on an x86 architecture box. That would be great. It really would make life easier. You could probably then just turn to some generic virtual machine replication tools. You could use the replication tools specific to VMware or whatever hypervisor you're using. Sadly, what we have in the IT environments of the customers we talk to is this sort of United Colors of Benetton model. There's physical and there's virtual servers. There's Windows and there's Linux. And oh, by the way, there's also Solaris and AIX and on and on. And there's remote offices, and they may be running some of their own servers that might not be quite the template-based setup that the home office has, right? So the point here is accept the fact that you may be trying to achieve that holy grail of completely homogeneous environment, but what you really have is a bit messier. And so the solution you're going to look for needs to be one that can handle that. If you go with one of these simpler disaster recovery solutions that covers, well, you say to yourself, it covers all of my x86 VM, that's great, but you may have a very critical system that's running on Linux. Maybe it's the Apache web server that you're running your e-commerce site on. Can you really afford not to have that protected if you're an eater, right? Or maybe your Oracle financials, for whatever reason, running on a Solaris box, and can you run your business without that? So be realistic and really press the vendors, the providers that you're talking to, that they've got the technology and the skill set and the experience to handle these heterogeneous environments. Closely related to that is the choice of data protection technologies. So again, I'm seeing some pretty funny information out on the internet. People are encouraged to think about data protection. What the trend has been over the last decade is data protection, workload protection tools that work at a block level. They're monitoring all the reads and writes to your storage systems on any given server. And on a block-by-block basis, as blocks of data change on the hard drive, those changes are immediately replicated. This is what gives you disaster recovery, because when you're just looking at the entire disk on a system, it means you're tracking the changes not only in the data, which would be great if all you cared about was backup, but you're changing all the updates to the operating system as you patch it, and all the updates to the application. And so the replica that you've created is the operating system, the application, all the config files, and the data. That means that if you have a disaster, if you have a server failure, you can spin up that entire server as it was. So don't get distracted by file level anything. That means you're thinking about it as a backup challenge, and that's not the right approach. These block level technologies come in a variety of flavors. The more advanced ones are designed with certain applications in mind. They can be smarter about how they replicate all those writes to disk, knowing that they're running on a SharePoint server or an Oracle server or what have you. And you get better quiescence of the data, and you can have faster snapshotting. You can get your recovery point objective down to 15 minutes with these technologies. Now, sometimes other approaches to data protection are actually preferable, depending on your environment. Some of them are actually starting to be built into the application. It's not happening with most of the critical IT systems, business IT systems yet, but we're seeing a few where it's really worthwhile to make sure that your recovery as a service provider understands them and takes advantage of them. A great example is Microsoft Exchange 2010 has this new capability called Database Availability Groups, or DAG. And it lets multiple Exchange mailbox servers be grouped together and to use each other's storage as in an active-passive setup for mailbox data. So if a mailbox server loses its database, it can redirect and start using what were the passive copies on the other mailbox server as active. Well, if you put one of those mailbox servers outside of your data center and in the hands of some sort of recovery as a service provider, you've got disaster recovery for your Exchange using this built-in capability. It's a really great technology that Microsoft has developed. It works splendidly. So what you want to ask your vendor is, can you support it? Is this one of the tools in the toolkit that your recovery as a service provider supports? And you may also find that there are times when you do want to use the built-in virtual machine replication. VMware has got Site Recovery Manager, and if you've got some systems running on VMware, that could be a good approach for protecting those servers. So I guess my point is, it isn't one size fits all. There are multiple data protection technologies and tools available. And for you to get the best overall protection for that heterogeneous environment that I'm presuming that you have, you want to make sure you're taking advantage of all the possible tools. And testing. And as I said at the top, those of you who have spoken with N-Scale in the past, you know that this is our favorite topic, because we see so many companies that have put together some sort of, we call it do-it-yourself, DIY, disaster recovery plan. And it takes a tremendous amount of effort for them to go get the colo space, buy the hardware, install the software, and then keep that up to date. And it's very manual and it's very labor intensive. And then they don't test it because they just don't have the time or the energy. They've run out. And it's made worse by what some people refer to as change skew, right? That is, in your production environment, you are routinely changing the configuration settings on your servers. You are patching the operating systems. You are updating and upgrading the applications to new versions. And when you decide, let's say 6 months later, well, let's go do a test of our disaster recovery system, the versions that you have running out in that duplicate site are completely out of date. So doing a test would be invalid. So companies realize, well, I guess every time we make a change to the production environment, we have to go and change our DR environment. And either they do it and it takes a ton of work, or they don't do it. And in that case, you just don't have a disaster recovery solution because it's out of date and you haven't tested it. One of the things that the approach we've described so far does, where you have this sort of block level, near real-time replication of your servers, is that you don't have to worry about keeping the disaster environment up to date. It's always up to date because every time you make a change to a server, that change is being replicated. So the way we put it is now there's no excuse. Right now you can't complain, well, we can't test DR because we know the DR environment is out of date. The other problem, of course, that people cite is, well, if we try to test the disaster recovery solution, it's going to interfere with the production environment, and there's no good time for that. Our end users are never going to stand for that. But again, there's no excuse, because what you'll find is that the providers of recovery as a service who are at the leading edge of this, they provide not just one virtual environment for you to run DR in, but they'll provide multiple ones. One that would be your production environment if you had to do a failover, but one that's a test environment, and where you can test the disaster environment. You can simulate a failover in a test virtual LAN and have no impact at all on end users, and you're not going to screw up IP addresses. So you have to test it, and even though I've just said this block level replication is going to ensure that everything's up to date, the testing is trying to unearth more subtle things, like dependencies. One server maybe has to be started and up and running before you can boot another server because the one depends on the other. It's become so common now for business applications to require multiple servers all running at once. And an e-commerce site is an obvious example. You've got one server running the web server, another one running the application server, a third one running the database, right? And you've got to get them all running in the correct order. So part of testing isn't just going into an interface and pressing buttons and seeing what happens. It's the offline stuff. It's writing a run book and then exercising that run book and seeing if it works, and if there's a glitch, go back and adjust it and do it over again. It's the people part of things. You need to make sure everybody understands their roles and responsibilities, and we're talking about the roles and responsibilities not only within your IT department, but between your department and the recovery provider that you're using. Have you chosen a provider that's completely hands-off? What they're offering is all self-service, and in a disaster, you're on your own, which may or may not be what you're looking for. Or are you working with a provider where to declare any disaster, even a simple single server failure, and you just want to quickly spin up a duplicate, you have to make a phone call, and it's very hands-on with no self-service. Or are you working with a provider that lets you choose? Do you want to talk to somebody, or do you want to do it yourself, right? Because, again, it's not one size fits all. It depends on your IT organization, how you want to handle these things, and we think it also depends on what is the so-called disaster. Is it a single server failure and you just need to quickly spin up a replica until you can buy some new hardware? Or are we talking about a site-wide failure caused by a blackout or a fire? How much help do you want to have from your provider, and how much do you want to be forced to rely on them? So that's very important. The other thing that we've learned over the years at Nscaled is, despite the fact that we talk a lot about the servers and the software and the technologies and the applications, disasters are about people, particularly like the real disasters. So we had several of our customers affected by Hurricane Irene this past summer. And when you've got something really big and ugly like a hurricane, you realize very quickly disasters are about people. People are making decisions about how do they protect their families. Do they need to leave their homes? Do they need to drive somewhere else? And very quickly, the focus in a disaster can shift away from your business systems towards keeping people safe. You, as an IT department, need to engage with your entire organization and understand what will happen. What if there's a hurricane? What will we do? What if there is a major metro-wide blackout? What will we do? And then make sure you're vendor can work with you in the conditions that you set forth. Can they initiate the disaster declaration? Can they run things while your employees are getting to higher ground, or whatever the case may be? So I know that this slide says testing, and I'm getting into some things maybe that don't sound like testing, but it's all about the preparedness. It's all about going beyond the mindset of thinking that, okay, we're doing block level replication and we've got our heterogeneous servers protected in a technical fashion. You need to think beyond the technology. So those were the 5 points that we wanted to talk about today, and we're happy to field any questions that you might have. If you type them into the GoToWebinar control panel that you've got on your screen, we're happy to answer your questions. All right, so I've got one question here asking how often should you test your DR environment? I'm not sure there's a single right answer to that. What we typically do with our customers is plan on testing everything twice a year. And that means ensuring that all of the servers do in fact spin up, boot up as servers can be connected to. All of this is done in a test VLAN, so it doesn't affect production. And again, what we typically will do with our customers is also make sure that we're doing all this based on their run book, and we can that way surface any problems if their run book has omitted any important steps or issues. Okay, so another question here. Isn't disaster recovery more expensive than backup? It certainly used to be, and considerably more expensive. And the pattern that we saw over the last 10 years was that real disaster recovery tended to be for large enterprises and involved a lot of money and a lot of manpower, and could still be very labor intensive, not only in setting up the disaster recovery solution, but in exercising it in the event of a disaster. What I spoke about earlier, though, is just in the last few years, there's really been a massive change in what disaster recovery solutions have to cost. And that's just really piggybacking on what has happened with virtualization technologies, these replication technologies that we've been discussing, and the ability of a cloud-based solution to over-provision. And that is, understand that obviously not all customers are going to declare a disaster at once. So in a shared physical environment, basically do some actuarial work and understand how many customers can be put on a system safely with absolutely no chance of resource contention. But it's obviously not one-to-one, right? At Nscaled, we don't have to have one-to-one correspondence between our cloud-based infrastructure and the sum of all of our customers' infrastructures. It means that the solution works for every customer every time, but it also means that we haven't had to build and pay for and therefore charge our customers for nearly the amount that they would do so building their own, because when you build your own disaster recovery, it is one-to-one, and it's far more expensive. So the pattern that you're observing now, and I think we still haven't seen all of it, is prices coming down. And right now we're talking to customers and we explain our disaster recovery as a service and we price it out for them. And the reaction very often will be, well, that's what I'm paying just for my backup solution. And I think that's basically where we are, is that today, if you're a mid-sized business and you always thought that you were priced out of disaster recovery, take another look, because we think that what you're going to find is, for what you're paying for just plain old backup today, you can get true disaster recovery. And then, as we said, backup simply becomes a feature in that disaster recovery solution. I hope that makes sense. I don't see any more questions coming in, so do we have some more questions? Let's see here. All right, so somebody asks, we are a medium-sized business with no DR strategy. How do we get help in prioritizing and developing an overall plan? I think that if the question is coming from an IT person, I think the first thing that you need to do, and I know this probably sounds obvious, is you need to work with the business unit owners to make sure you understand what are the business systems that you're currently operating and supporting for them that they absolutely can't live without. What are the ones that, and you just have to kind of, do some game planning, do some scenario testing with them. What if there were a metro-wide blackout and power were not restored for 3 days? What are those applications that your employees would have to have? Are we talking about, are you a law firm? Are you a university? Are you a retailer? What has to be running? And I think that's going to give you the answer. Things like print servers usually don't make the cut, right? If you're an e-commerce company, you've got to keep that website up and running. Email almost always makes the cut. We still haven't worked with a customer that doesn't put email on that list. SharePoint, for some businesses, they can't live without it. For others, they say, that's okay. For 3 or 4 days, we don't have to have it, right? So your mileage may vary, but I think this is something where you just need to make sure you're working with the business to understand those things. And again, as I said, prioritize them and understand what your budget is. And hopefully, depending on the provider you're talking to, you'll be pleasantly surprised by how many of your Tier 2 and maybe even Tier 3 systems you can afford to protect. So somebody is asking a question about our business. How many data centers does Nscale utilize in our infrastructure? So right now, David, we're up to 4 data centers that we've got. We've got 2 here in the United States, and we've got 2 over in the United Kingdom. And we forecast adding about 4 more next year as our business grows. And how are they dispersed geographically? Let's see, right now we are on the East Coast and in the Midwest of the United States. And as I said, we've got 2 in the United Kingdom with plans to expand basically wherever our business takes us. And we're seeing a lot of demand coming in Canada, the EU, but really just all over the place. Well, this is an interesting question. How will the recent rise in hard drive prices affect the cost of disaster recovery and business continuity going forward? So far we haven't been impacted by that too much. We tend to have to build our systems somewhat ahead of demand to make sure that they're in place as our sales team is out signing up business. I suspect there'll be a small overall increase in what it costs us to build and maintain our data centers. I think that this rise in hard drive prices, though, is a temporary phenomenon. I think that nobody sees it as a permanent change in the industry. Now that the floods have receded and manufacturing is back online in Thailand and elsewhere, I don't anticipate that we're going to be passing along any price increases to our customers driven by that factor alone. I suppose some providers may have to have some sort of temporary rise in the prices, sort of the way the airlines bumped up their airfares based on fuel costs. But for a business like Nscale, that's just a part of our cost of providing this service to customers. I don't think it's going to make a material difference in anything that we have to pass on to the customers. Can we talk about the probability of an outage occurring? We find that it's the mundane things. Yeah, so that's exactly right. That's a great question, Chris. And again, I alluded to it. This whole field is called disaster recovery, business continuity. It all sounds very dreadful. And in fact, I mean, part of what we're talking about are the big deal events. I mentioned Hurricane Irene and how that affected our East Coast customers. And some of you will recall that just a day or two after Irene finally blew itself out, the greater San Diego metro region had a massive blackout. And now, fortunately, that blackout only lasted, I think it was about 8 or 12 hours. So there are big deal events that happen, and last year seemed to have been a banner year for it, what with the earthquake and tsunami in Japan and Hurricane Irene. But it is the mundane things that really end up being the bulk of what you're trying to protect. You have a NIC card go bad in a server. You get hit with a virus, and now you have to take maybe it's your Exchange mail server, you're going to take it offline for a half a day or a day. Well, it's not a disaster in the sense of what we've been talking about, but if it means you have to take a server offline, you can't ask your employees to stop using email for that half a day, can you? You need to be able to very quickly spin up a replica. You want the data on that replica to be up to date, and you want to have that up and running as quickly as possible, hopefully in 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, so everybody gets to keep working and the end users don't even notice that you've done it. What are the causes of most outages? I don't have the data available, but to that previous question, most of the reasons our customers fail over, if you will, to us are these mundane things. I didn't go into details. We've got a hybrid architecture where part of the recovery as a service platform is an appliance that we install in the customer's network. And that is the target that customers fail over to, quote unquote, when they have one of these mundane minor disasters. Their data center is fine. It's not a hurricane. It's not a blackout. It's just something happened to one application or to one server. It crashed, whatever the reason is. And they just point to the replica of that server running or is stored in our appliance right there on their network. It's actually something like a 100-to-1 factor. I'll throw that number out there, Chris. For every 100 times that they just need to point to a replica running on that local appliance, there might be one time when they actually have to fail over to the replica that's running in one of our regional data centers. And 100-to-1 may even not be the right ratio. It's those mundane things. But again, I want to stress, we can say mundane and give people the false impression that, well, it's not important, or, oh, I could, have my Exchange server running a lot faster than that. And that's what's going to kill you, right? Because you're not. It's going to turn out that you don't have that spare NIC card. It's going to turn out that the virus really hosed your entire operating system. And doing bare metal recoveries just isn't fast. It never is, right? It always takes hours and hours and hours, and you just can't take that time. So anyway, it looks like we've gotten to all the questions. I really appreciate everybody's attention this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from. Thank you very much, and we hope you'll join us next month.